Number 10 and number 11 Downing Street are neighbouring properties, and their occupants should pursue a close working relationship to maintain faith in the government's economic policy. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, had a challenging week in the markets as the price of government debt rose and the pound fell while she went to China. When first asked about her position, the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, failed to say that she would remain in her post until the election. The collaboration between Prime Minister and Chancellor lies at the heart of government. What have been the consequences of the troubled relationships over the years? Joining me now to discuss this partnership is the historian Anthony Seldon. Marvellous to see you. What do you think would have been the impact on Rachel Reeves and her office when the Prime Minister couldn't, at first, find it in his mouth to say, of course she'll stay until the general election, at least?
Well, I think it showed a certain ignorance by the Prime Minister of the reality of the relationship. Had he got rid of Rachel Reeves, he would have gone within a month or two. I mean, that is what happens. He would have been so weakened. And here's why. Because her policy was his policy, and there's no new policy that he could offer to say, look, I've got rid of my Chancellor because she was doing the wrong thing. Everything that she did was done with his say-so, just like Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. I mean, it was much more Liz's policy than it was Kwarteng's, and so it was even more absurd. But also, you know, there's no one else to have taken the place. Nobody, I mean, he is on cloud cuckoo land if he thinks there was anybody else who could do the job. I mean, the only person with a smidgen of a chance is somebody who knew the Treasury from the inside out, been a cabinet minister, been the leader of the party, and that's Ed Miliband. And he wouldn't have worked either because there's no policy. So, you know, they stand or they fall together. That's the lesson of the last 40 years.
So we've established that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor's policies are the same. This has, of course, not always been the case. There's supposedly the famous time when Gordon Brown went to the Cabinet before presenting his budget to the House of Commons. It's normally a time when the Chancellor briefs the Cabinet. He wasn't prepared even to tell the Cabinet, apparently, the details of the budget, ending up with Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, saying, "Go on, Gordon, give us a clue." Yeah. That was a very different relationship.
Well, it was. And, you know, for 10 years we were told that they had a spectacularly close relationship, and, of course, they didn't. And Gordon Brown had one major political objective, which was to get into number 10. He always thought, that he would be the better Prime Minister. He thought he understood policy much better. He did. He understood the Labour Party much better. He did. But he clearly didn't have those presentational gifts and strategic gifts that Blair had. So that was a very tense relationship. Look, Michael, you know, because you have been on the inside, you've seen it much more closely than I ever will. It is often tense, and you were there at the heart of one of the most tense relationships. I don't think that Margaret Thatcher ever survived fully the elimination of Nigel Lawson in 1989, his departure. Liz Truss clearly didn't with Kwarteng, but John Major didn't when she eventually got rid of, after Black Wednesday in 1992, she got rid of Norman Lamont. He was on the back foot all the way. Now, what actually happened there? And how come you, Michael, I've never known the answer to this, how come you were the great survivor? Because you were Chief Secretary, number 2 to Norman Lamont, kaput, he goes, in comes Ken Clarke, and who's his number 2? My goodness, it's Michael Portillo. How did that happen?
Well, part of the story is this, that I held a 40th birthday party on May the 26th.
Doesn't totally explain it.
And Margaret Thatcher attended, Norman Lamont attended, John Major had been invited but failed to attend. While they were all celebrating at my party, the Prime Minister, John Major, summoned the Chief Whip round to number 10, and they decapitated Norman Lamont. So when Norman Lamont returned from my 40th birthday party, he found that he was no longer Chancellor of the Exchequer. And the next morning, I was the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, I greeted the new Chancellor, Mr. Kenneth Clarke. And I think the Prime Minister simply thought that it was quite bad enough changing Chancellor without changing the 2 cabinet ministers at the Treasury at the same time. And indeed, I had been the special advisor to Nigel Lawson. I was a huge respecter of his. And he was very, very keen on the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. But there came a moment where she was taking her economic advice from Sir
Alan Waters.
Yeah. Sir Alan Waters. And he said, you cannot have, effectively, 2 chancellors. But your point, let's go back to you, because you're the guest, your point is that once a Prime Minister has disposed of a Chancellor, the Prime Minister's days are numbered.
Yes, I think that's right. By the way, that was the most Machiavellian story. I mean, Tim Shipman's never had anything to compare to that story, Michael. But back on mission, yes. I mean, the Prime Minister, I've always felt it's an impossible job. It's becoming an impossible job because, we see them from the outside as all powerful. Look at the incredible churn of Prime Ministers all the way. We've had 6 in 10 years. I mean, none of them have left totally satisfied. It's very hard to do the job. But I think it's also becoming... I've always thought that the Chancellor was becoming more and more significant, but it's the Chancellor impotence. I mean, none of them have been able to get significant productivity growth or growth in the economy since the global financial crisis. The levers at the Chancellor's disposal have got narrower and narrower. So, it's very hard. We've had 8 chancellors, 8 in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
The previous 40 years only saw 8. So the churn is 4 times quicker in the last 10 years.
Gordon Brown was Chancellor of the Exchequer for 10 years.
Yep.
Let me ask you this question. The Prime Minister is the First Lord of the Treasury. Do you think it makes a difference where the Prime Minister is savvy, economically speaking, where the Prime Minister is someone who would be capable of doing the Chancellor's job? Does that make things better or worse? The reason it might make them worse is it means the Prime Minister is always second-guessing the Chancellor.
Well, it hasn't always been happy. Harold Macmillan had been Chancellor, but then his Chancellor of the Exchequer, Peter Thornycroft, resigned. He thought that Macmillan was a spendthrift in 1958. And Gordon Brown had a very bad relationship, mostly with Alistair Darling for 3 years when Brown was PM, Darling was Chancellor. And Rishi Sunak then had Jeremy Hunt. He couldn't do anything else other than keep Jeremy Hunt. So it can be very awkward for a Chancellor if you've got the PM breathing down your throat. But you've got to get on well. I mean, good examples of somebody who did it well was Major and Ken Clarke. You saw that, but maybe you disagree, Michael.
No,
for 4 years, that was good. Cameron and Osborne,
yeah,
they got on well. That was a good relationship. But and I think that Reeves and Starmer are up there. They stand and they stand together and they will fall together. They're inseparable.
Yes. I would just make one other point. We've been talking away about the weakness of the Chancellor. I just want to make the point that the Chancellor is in an extraordinary position because that moment of doing the budget, it is the Chancellor's judgment. The Chancellor stands and falls by that judgment, and the Chancellor has extraordinary autonomy. I think more autonomy on that day, in that hour, when he or she delivers the budget than any other minister at any other time. And someone like Ken Clarke, and possibly even Rachel Reeves today, Ken knew that he couldn't be sacked, and that gave him an extraordinary amount of power. If Rachel Reeves decides that she can't be sacked, that'll give her a lot of power too.
Absolutely. And he will have to... And she understands. I mean, Keir Starmer doesn't understand economics. That gives you a big strength as Chancellor. She is there for the duration. We just merely don't know how long the duration will be.
Very good. Thank you so much for your historical perspective.